He walked into the private jet dealership wearing torn jeans and muddy work boots. The sales team laughed, asking if he planned to pay with food stamps, but when he revealed who he really was and why he needed the plane, everyone was left speechless. It was a Tuesday morning when Robert Mitchell parked his beat-up 1997 Ford pickup truck outside Elite Aviation Sales, the most exclusive private aircraft dealership in Miami. The contrast couldn't have been starker. $1 million jets gleamed under the Florida sun while his rusty truck looked like it belonged in a scrapyard, not next to these flying palaces. Robert was 65 years old, with calloused hands that told the story of decades of hard work, and a weathered face that had seen more storms than most people could imagine. He wore a faded flannel shirt with a small tear near the pocket, work jeans that had seen better days, and steel-toed boots caked with dried mud from his morning chores. In his shirt pocket, he carried a folded piece of paper that meant more to him than anything else in the world. As he pushed through the glass doors of the dealership, the cool air conditioning hit him like a wall, and he found himself in a world that seemed designed to intimidate. The showroom was a temple to luxury, with polished marble floors that reflected the overhead lights like mirrors. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, and the smell of expensive leather mixed with that distinctive new aircraft scent filled the air. 3 sales representatives stood near a gleaming Gulfstream that cost more than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, their tailored suits probably worth more than Robert's entire wardrobe. When they noticed him walking in, their expressions shifted from professional smiles to barely concealed disgust. The silence that followed was deafening. You could practically hear their thoughts racing as they sized up this man who clearly didn't belong in their world of private jets and millionaire clients. Robert cleared his throat and spoke with that deep, steady voice of someone who had never felt the need to apologize for who he was. But what happened next would change everything these people thought they knew about judging others by their appearance. "Good morning," Robert said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had faced far worse than a few judgmental stares. "I'd like to speak with someone about purchasing a private jet." The words hung in the air like a bad joke, and the 3 salespeople exchanged glances that spoke volumes about what they were thinking. Marcus Thompson, the senior sales manager, was a man in his early 40s who wore his arrogance like an expensive cologne. His perfectly styled hair, designer watch and suit that cost more than most people's cars all screamed success, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who measured human worth by bank account balances. Marcus let out a barely suppressed chuckle and whispered something to his colleague Sarah Williams, who immediately covered her mouth to hide her laughter. The third salesperson, David Chen, shook his head in disbelief as if he'd just witnessed someone trying to buy a spaceship with Monopoly money. "Sir," Marcus began, his tone dripping with condescension, "are you sure you're in the right place? This is Elite Aviation Sales, not a used car lot." The comment sent ripples of laughter through the small group, but Robert remained perfectly still, his weathered hands clasped calmly behind his back. "I'm looking for a Bombardier Global 7000. Robert continued, completely ignoring the mockery in their voices. "I need it equipped with full medical facilities and the longest possible range configuration." The specificity of his request should have caught their attention, but instead it only seemed to fuel their amusement. Sarah leaned toward Marcus and whispered loud enough for Robert to hear. He probably saw it in a movie and memorized the name. The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, echoing off the marble walls of the showroom. But there was something in Robert's eyes that should have warned them they were making a terrible mistake. A quiet strength that came from years of facing real challenges, real loss, real responsibility. What you're about to discover is that some of the most extraordinary people in this world deliberately choose to dress down, to blend in, to avoid the attention that wealth can bring. Me conte nos comentários. O que você faria nessa situação? Would you stay calm like Robert, or would you have walked out already? Marcus walked closer to Robert, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with each deliberate step. "Sir, do you have any idea what a Global 7000 costs? We're talking about $45 million, not including the medical equipment modifications you mentioned." His voice carried the patronizing tone of someone explaining basic math to a child. Robert nodded calmly and reached into his shirt pocket, pulling out that folded piece of paper he'd been carrying. "I'm aware of the price," he said simply. "That's why I'm here to make a cash purchase." The word cash sent another wave of snickers through the group. David stepped forward, his designer tie probably worth more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Cash? He repeated mockingly. Sir, this isn't a roadside vegetable stand. You can't just show up with a wheelbarrow full of bills and expect to buy a jet. Sarah joined in the ridicule, her perfectly manicured nails catching the light as she gestured dismissively. Maybe he thinks he can trade in his pickup truck as a down payment, she said, causing all three salespeople to burst into fresh laughter. Robert stood there absorbing every cruel word, every mocking gesture, every assumption they made about his worth based solely on his appearance. But beneath that calm exterior, something was building. Not anger exactly, but a deep sadness for people who had lost touch with basic human decency. He'd seen this before, this ugly side of wealth that turned people into shallow judges of character. "Can I speak with the owner of this dealership?" he asked quietly, his voice steady despite the treatment he was receiving. "Mr. Harrison doesn't meet with just anyone who walks in off the street," Marcus replied with a smirk. "He only deals with serious buyers, people who can actually afford our aircraft." The implication was clear, and it hung in the air like a slap across Robert's weathered face. Little did they know that their assumption was about to cost them the biggest sale in the dealership's history, and more importantly, they were about to learn a lesson about the true meaning of dignity and grace under pressure. Robert looked around the showroom at the gleaming aircraft, each one representing someone's dreams of freedom, luxury, or in his case, something far more meaningful than material possession. "I'll wait," he said simply, settling into one of the expensive leather chairs in the customer lounge area. The chair probably cost more than many people made in a month, but Robert sat in it with the same comfortable dignity he'd shown since walking through those glass doors. His presence in their pristine showroom was clearly making the sales team uncomfortable, but he showed no signs of leaving. Minutes turned into an hour, and Robert remained perfectly still, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the luxury surrounding him. Marcus was growing increasingly agitated, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Important clients were due to arrive, and having this oddly dressed man sitting in their customer area was not the image Elite Aviation wanted to project. Sarah kept glancing at her phone, probably checking social media or texting her friends about the strange situation unfolding in their workplace. "Sir," Marcus tried again, his patience clearly wearing thin, "I really think you should consider looking at something more appropriate for your budget. Maybe a small prop plane or a used helicopter." The suggestion was meant to be helpful, but the condescension in his voice made it sound like another insult. Robert simply smiled and shook his head. "I need a Global 7000 with medical facilities," he repeated. "It's not negotiable." The firmness in his voice caught Marcus off guard, but instead of reconsidering his attitude, it only seemed to irritate him further. David whispered something to Sarah, who nodded and walked toward the back office. Robert noticed the exchange but didn't react. He'd learned long ago that patience was one of the most powerful weapons a person could possess. "Before de continuar, me fale nos comentários. Você já se sentiu preso numa situação assim? Sometimes the people who judge us the harshest are the ones who understand us the least." 2 hours had passed, and Robert Mitchell hadn't moved from that leather chair. His patience was legendary among those who knew him, forged through years of watching crops grow, waiting for weather to change, and enduring challenges that would have broken lesser men. But the sales team at Elite Aviation was beginning to panic. Their 2 o'clock appointment was a tech billionaire looking to upgrade his fleet, and having this inappropriately dressed man in their showroom was becoming a crisis they couldn't ignore. Marcus approached Robert one more time, his professional facade cracking under the pressure. "Look, I'm going to be honest with you," he said, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "This is embarrassing for everyone involved. You're clearly not understanding the situation here. This place, these jets, they're for a different kind of clientele." The words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was crystal clear. Robert was being told he didn't belong, that his presence was somehow contaminating their pristine environment. "What kind of clientele?" Robert asked, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, realizing he'd walked into dangerous territory. "You know, successful business people, entrepreneurs, celebrities, people who can actually afford these aircraft." The implication stung, but Robert had heard worse in his 65 years. He'd been underestimated, dismissed, and written off more times than he could count, but he'd also proven every single doubter wrong. Sarah returned from the back office with a security guard, a large man named Tony, who looked uncomfortable with the situation, but was clearly following orders. "Sir," Tony said apologetically, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're disrupting business operations." Robert looked up at the security guard, seeing not an enemy, but another working man just trying to do his job. "I understand you're following orders," Robert said kindly, "but I'm not leaving until I speak with Mr. Harrison about purchasing an aircraft." The standoff continued, with Robert sitting calmly in the leather chair while the security guard stood awkwardly nearby, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of physically removing an elderly man who wasn't causing any real trouble. Marcus was practically sweating now, his expensive suit showing damp patches under the arms as he realized this situation was spinning completely out of control. Important clients were starting to arrive, and word was spreading through Miami's elite circles about the strange scene unfolding at Elite Aviation. That's when Congressman Bradley Walsh walked through the glass doors, his entourage of assistants and bodyguards filling the showroom with an air of importance and authority. Bradley was a powerful man in his 50s, someone who was used to having doors opened for him and red carpets rolled out wherever he went. He took one look at Robert sitting in the customer chair, and his expression shifted from neutral politeness to obvious disgust. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Marcus rushed over to the congressman, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Congressman Walsh, I sincerely apologize for this situation. We're handling it right now." But Bradley wasn't satisfied with that response. He strode over to Robert, his designer shoes clicking imperiously against the marble floor. "Excuse me," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but this establishment caters to a very exclusive clientele. Your presence is inappropriate and frankly offensive to the people who actually belong here." Robert looked up at the congressman with those steady eyes that had seen more real struggle and genuine hardship than this politician could ever imagine. "I belong wherever I choose to spend my money," Robert replied quietly. The response caught Bradley off guard, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his arrogance. "Antes de eu revelar o que aconteceu, escrevam nos comentários. O que você faria no lugar dele neste momento? Sometimes the people who wield the most power are the ones who understand it the least." "Your money?" Congressman Walsh laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the showroom. "What money? You look like you haven't seen a paycheck in years." The cruelty in his words was matched by the approving nods from Marcus, Sarah, and David, who seemed emboldened by having such a powerful ally in their corner. Robert absorbed the insult without flinching, but something flickered in his eyes, a flash of steel that suggested this man had depths they couldn't begin to fathom. "I'm waiting to speak with Mr. Harrison about purchasing a Bombardier Global 7000, Robert said once again, his voice never wavering from that calm, steady tone. Bradley threw back his head and laughed even harder. "You want to buy a $45 million jet? What's next? Are you going to tell us you're buying the Empire State Building?" The congressman's entourage joined in the laughter, creating a chorus of mockery that would have crushed a lesser man's spirit. But Robert Mitchell was not a lesser man. He was someone who had built an empire from nothing, who had overcome obstacles that would have destroyed most people, and who carried a burden of grief that gave him a perspective on what truly mattered in life. "Congressman," Robert said, rising slowly from his chair, "you might want to be careful about judging people based on their appearance. Sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones you'd least expect." The comment seemed to strike a nerve with Bradley, who stepped closer to Robert with an aggressive stance. "Are you threatening me?" he demanded. "Do you know who I am?" Robert nodded calmly. "I know exactly who you are, Congressman Walsh. The question is, do you know who I am?" The challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm, and everyone in the showroom could feel the tension building to an explosive crescendo. Just as the confrontation seemed ready to boil over, the glass doors of Elite Aviation opened once more, and in walked Charles Harrison himself, the owner of the dealership. Charles was a distinguished man in his late 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention. He'd built his aviation empire from the ground up and had developed an instinct for reading people that had served him well throughout his career. The moment he saw the scene unfolding in his showroom, his expression darkened with anger. "What the hell is going on here?" Charles demanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Marcus rushed to explain, stumbling over his words in his haste to justify the situation. "Mr. Harrison, this gentleman has been disrupting our operations for hours, claiming he wants to buy a Global 7000. and Congressman Walsh was just trying to help resolve the situation. But Charles wasn't looking at Marcus. His eyes were fixed on Robert, and something about the older man's bearing caught his attention. Charles had spent 40 years in business, and he'd learned to recognize authenticity when he saw it. There was something about Robert that didn't match the narrative being presented by his sales team. "And what exactly has this gentleman done to disrupt your operations?" Charles asked, his tone suggesting he wasn't buying their explanation. "He's just been sitting here," Tony, the security guard, admitted reluctantly. "He's been polite, hasn't raised his voice, hasn't bothered anyone. He just wants to talk to you about buying a plane." Congressman Walsh stepped forward, clearly expecting Charles to side with him based on their long-standing business relationship. "Charles, surely you can see this situation is inappropriate. This man obviously doesn't belong here, and his presence is making your legitimate customers uncomfortable." But Charles Harrison hadn't become successful by accepting things at face value, and something about this entire situation was setting off alarm bells in his experienced mind. Before we continue, answer me in the comments. Who are you rooting for in this story? Charles Harrison studied Robert Mitchell with the keen eye of someone who had seen every type of person walk through his doors over the decades. Wealthy tech moguls in hoodies, oil executives in cowboy boots, entertainment industry giants in casual clothes. He'd learned long ago that true wealth often came disguised in the most unexpected packages. "Sir," Charles said, addressing Robert directly, "I apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced here today. Would you mind if I asked what brings you to Elite Aviation?" Robert reached into his shirt pocket once again and carefully unfolded that precious piece of paper he'd been carrying. "I need to purchase a Bombardier Global 7000 with full medical configuration," he said simply. "Range isn't as important as the medical capabilities, but I need the fastest delivery possible." The specificity of his request and the calm way he delivered it caused Charles to raise an eyebrow. This wasn't the rambling of someone who didn't know what they were talking about. "Medical configuration is quite specialized," Charles observed. "May I ask what you need it for?" Robert's expression softened, and for the first time since entering the dealership, his emotional armor showed a crack. "I run a medical transport charity," he explained quietly. "We fly critically ill children to hospitals when their families can't afford it. Our current aircraft is getting old, and we need something more reliable." The words hung in the air, completely changing the dynamic of the conversation. Marcus, Sarah, and David exchanged glances, suddenly realizing their assumptions might have been catastrophically wrong. Congressman Walsh shifted uncomfortably, his political instincts warning him that this situation was about to take a turn he wasn't prepared for. Charles Harrison, meanwhile, was beginning to piece together a puzzle that would shock everyone in that showroom. "A medical transport charity," Charles repeated thoughtfully. "That's quite an undertaking. May I ask which organization you represent?" Robert hesitated for just a moment, not out of shame, but because he knew his answer was going to change everything. "The Mitchell Foundation," he said simply. "We operate across the southeastern United States." The name hit Charles Harrison like a lightning bolt, and his face went pale as recognition dawned. The Mitchell Foundation was legendary in charitable circles, an organization that had quietly saved thousands of lives over the past 15 years. Charles had heard stories about the mysterious founder who personally flew missions, who paid for everything out of his own pocket, who never sought publicity or recognition. "You're Robert Mitchell," Charles whispered, his voice filled with awe. The Robert Mitchell. The word sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd, though most of them still didn't understand the significance. Marcus looked confused, Sarah appeared lost, and even Congressman Walsh seemed uncertain about what was happening. But Charles Harrison knew exactly who was standing in his showroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles announced, his voice trembling with emotion, "you have just spent the last 3 hours humiliating one of the most generous philanthropists in the country. Robert Mitchell has personally funded the medical transport of over 10,000 children. He saved more lives than most people could save in a dozen lifetimes." The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear a pin drop in that marble-floored showroom as the full weight of their mistakes began to settle on everyone present. Marcus felt his knees go weak. Sarah covered her mouth in horror, and David looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. But the real shock was yet to come, because Robert Mitchell's story was about to get much more personal and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Charles Harrison turned to face his sales team and the congressman, his expression a mixture of fury and disappointment that cut deeper than any shouting could have. "Do you people have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Mr. Mitchell doesn't just run a charity. He started the Mitchell Foundation after losing his only child in a medical emergency that could have been prevented if they'd had faster transport to a specialized hospital. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Robert's weathered face showed the pain of that memory, the grief that had never fully healed and probably never would. "My daughter Emma was 7 years old," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "She had a rare heart condition that required emergency surgery at a children's hospital 300 miles away. We drove through the night, but it wasn't fast enough. She died in my arms in the back seat of my truck just 20 minutes from the hospital." The raw honesty in his words left everyone speechless. "That was 18 years ago," Robert continued. "I swore that night that no parent would ever have to watch their child die because of distance or lack of money for proper transport. So I sold my construction company, bought my first medical transport plane, and started flying kids myself. Every child we save, every family we keep together, it's Emma's legacy." His words carried the weight of nearly 2 decades of grief transformed into purpose, of a man who had turned his greatest loss into his life's mission. Marcus felt sick to his stomach, realizing he'd mocked a man who had dedicated his life to saving children. Sarah was crying openly, thinking about her own kids at home. Even Congressman Walsh looked shaken, his political armor cracked by the simple power of genuine human suffering and sacrifice. Se essa história tá mexendo com você, deixa like aí. Sometimes the people we dismiss as worthless are actually the most valuable human beings we'll ever encounter. In 18 years, we've transported over 10,000 children. Robert continued, his voice growing stronger as he talked about his life's work. Kids with cancer who needed specialized treatment, babies born with heart defects, children injured in accidents who needed trauma centers. We've never charged a family a single penny, and we never will. Every flight is funded entirely through my personal resources. He pulled out his phone and showed Charles a photo of their current aircraft, a smaller jet that was clearly showing its age. "This is what we're flying now," Robert explained. "She's been good to us, but she's getting unreliable. Last month we had to abort a mission because of engine trouble, and a 6-year-old boy had to wait an extra day for his surgery. That's unacceptable." The pain in his voice when he talked about that delayed mission was evident to everyone in the room. This wasn't about luxury or status. This was about life and death, about keeping a promise to a daughter who would never grow up. Charles Harrison was visibly moved, his own eyes misting as he listened to Robert's story. "Mr. Mitchell," he said softly, "I want you to know that Elite Aviation will do everything in our power to get you that Global 7000 as quickly as possible. We'll expedite the medical modifications, and I'll personally oversee the entire process." But Robert held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I appreciate that, Mr. Harrison, but I need to know that your people understand what this aircraft represents," Robert said, looking directly at Marcus, Sarah, and David. "Every day that plane sits on the ground is another day that a child might not get the help they need. This isn't just a purchase, it's a lifeline for families who have nowhere else to turn." Marcus Thompson stepped forward, his face pale and his hands trembling as he tried to find words adequate to the situation. "Mr. Mitchell," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to apologize for the way I treated you. There's no excuse for my behavior, and I understand if you never want to deal with me again." The arrogance that had defined him just hours earlier was completely gone, replaced by genuine remorse and shame. "I have a daughter," Sarah Williams added, tears streaming down her face. "She's 8 years old, just 1 year older than your Emma was. If something happened to her, if she needed help," she couldn't finish the sentence, overcome by the thought of being in Robert's position. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so incredibly sorry for judging you, for treating you like you didn't matter." Her words came from a place of genuine understanding now, from a mother's heart recognizing another parent's love. David Chen, who had been quiet through most of the confrontation, finally found his voice. "Sir, I grew up poor," he said, his confession surprising everyone. "My family came here with nothing, and people looked at us the same way we looked at you today. I should have known better. I should have remembered what it feels like to be dismissed because of how you look." His admission carried the weight of personal experience, of someone who had forgotten his own struggle in the pursuit of fitting in with wealth and status. Even Congressman Walsh seemed shaken by the revelation, though his response was more political than personal. "Mr. Mitchell, I had no idea about your foundation's work. If there's anything I can do to help, any legislation that might support your mission. But Robert cut him off with a gentle shake of his head. The time for political promises and public gestures had long passed. This was about something much more fundamental than policy or publicity. I don't need apologies, Robert said quietly, his weathered hands folded calmly in front of him. And I don't need promises about future support. What I need is for all of you to remember this moment, the next time you see someone who doesn't look like they belong in your world, because you never know whose life might depend on the kindness or cruelty you show to a stranger. His words carried the wisdom of someone who had seen the best and worst of humanity, often in the same day. Charles Harrison watched his sales team absorb this lesson, seeing in their faces the kind of learning that only comes from making a profound mistake and being forced to confront it directly. Mr. Mitchell is right, Charles said firmly. Today has been a masterclass in why we judge people by their character, not their clothing. I'm ashamed that it took this long for someone to treat you with the respect you deserved from the moment you walked through our doors. Robert turned to face the gleaming Bombardier Global 7000 that sat in the center of the showroom, its sleek lines representing so much more than luxury or convenience. In his mind, he could see Emma sitting in the co-pilot seat, her bright smile encouraging him to keep flying, keep saving, keep turning their shared tragedy into hope for other families. When can you have the medical modifications completed? He asked Charles, bringing the conversation back to its practical purpose. Normally it would take 6 months, Charles replied, but given the nature of your mission, I'll have our modification team work around the clock. We can have your new aircraft ready in 8 weeks. The promise represented not just a business transaction, but a commitment to saving lives, to honoring the memory of a little girl who had died too young, and to supporting a father who had refused to let grief destroy him. As Robert prepared to finalize the purchase details, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed a beautiful little girl with bright eyes and an infectious smile, sitting in the cockpit of a small airplane. This is Emma, he said softly, showing the picture to Charles and the others. She loved flying with me, even in our old crop duster. She said she wanted to be a pilot when she grew up, so she could help people too. The simple photograph carried more emotional weight than all the luxury surrounding them. She would have been 25 this year, Robert continued, his voice thick with the kind of love that transcends death. Sometimes when I'm flying a mission, I can almost hear her voice on the radio guiding me home. Every child we save, every family we keep together, it's her hands on the controls with mine. His words painted a picture of love so pure and enduring that even the marble walls seemed to absorb its warmth. Marcus, Sarah, and David stood in stunned silence, finally understanding the true magnitude of what they had witnessed. This wasn't just about money or aircraft or business transactions. This was about a father's love transformed into a mission that had saved thousands of lives, about grief that had become grace, about loss that had been transformed into legacy. The $45 million purchase wasn't about buying a plane. It was about buying hope for families they would never meet. Charles Harrison began preparing the paperwork, but his movements were reverent, as if he were handling sacred documents rather than sales contracts. Mr. Mitchell, he said, it would be an honor for Elite Aviation to be part of the Mitchell Foundation's mission. We'll make sure this aircraft serves your cause for many years to come. The promise carried the weight of understanding what this transaction really meant. As the contracts were being prepared, Robert Mitchell stood quietly by the window, looking out at the tarmac where his new aircraft would soon be prepared for its life-saving missions. The late afternoon sun streamed through the glass, casting long shadows across the showroom floor, and for a moment, the man who had been judged so harshly just hours earlier seemed to glow with an inner light that no amount of money could buy. There's one more thing I want you all to understand, Robert said, turning back to face the group that had learned such a profound lesson that day. Emma didn't just die because we couldn't get her to the hospital fast enough. She died because the ambulance service said they couldn't afford to make the trip, because the helicopter transport said our insurance wouldn't cover it, because at every step of the way, people saw dollar signs instead of a little girl who needed help. His words carried the accumulated pain of 18 years of fighting systems that put profit before people. That's why the Mitchell Foundation will always be free, he continued. That's why we'll never ask a family for their insurance information or their ability to pay, because when your child is dying, the last thing you should have to worry about is money. The conviction in his voice left no doubt that this mission would continue long after he was gone. that Emma's legacy would live on in the lives of countless children yet to be saved. Charles Harrison looked around his showroom at the expensive aircraft and luxurious appointments, suddenly seeing them in a completely different light. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, "I want to make a commitment to you. Elite Aviation will provide all maintenance and support for your new aircraft at cost, no markup, no profit. It's the least we can do to support your mission." The offer was spontaneous but heartfelt, a businessman recognizing something more valuable than profit. As Robert Mitchell walked out of Elite Aviation sales that evening, the keys to a $45 million aircraft in his pocket, he wasn't thinking about the luxury he had just purchased or the people who had judged him so harshly. He was thinking about Emma, about the promise he had made to her, and about all the children whose lives would be saved because of this new plane. The Bombardier Global 7000 wasn't just an aircraft to him. It was hope with wings, love in metal and engines, a father's grief transformed into a force for good in the world. The sales team that had mocked him stood in the showroom long after he left, each of them forever changed by what they had witnessed. They had learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the lives you touch, that real power comes not from what you can buy, but from what you're willing to give away, and that the most extraordinary people often come disguised as the most ordinary. Marcus Thompson would never again judge a customer by their appearance. Sarah Williams would tell her daughter about the man who turned tragedy into triumph, and David Chen would remember his own humble beginnings and treat every person with dignity. But perhaps the most important lesson of that day was simpler than all the complex truths about wealth and power and appearance. Sometimes the people we're quickest to dismiss are the ones with the most to teach us about what really matters in life. Robert Mitchell had walked into that dealership wearing work clothes and muddy boots, but he had carried with him something more valuable than all their expensive suits and luxury aircraft combined. A heart that had been broken but not defeated, a spirit that had been tested but not destroyed, and a love that had transcended death to become a beacon of hope for thousands of families. If you believe that good people are always rewarded, like the video. Tell us in the comments, what's the greatest act of kindness you've ever received? And if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, make sure to share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness and compassion can change the world, one life at a time. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove the best of humanity is still alive and thriving, even in a world that sometimes seems to have forgotten what truly matters.